Greetings. In this lecture, we are going to take a look at the Catholic or general epistles. Catholic not in terms of Roman Catholic, but Catholic in terms of universal or general. And so these are letters that are not directed to any particular congregation, like we have with Paul's letters to the church at Philippi, to the church at Rome. These are much more general in nature. And we refer to them typically as epistles as opposed to letters because of that general nature. Usually a letter is going to be more specific and targeted to a narrower audience. Epistles a little bit broader audience. The words are used pretty much synonymous in terms of New Testament studies. So Paul's letters, Paul's epistles, but here they're especially kind of epistle in terms of a broader audience, not the narrow particular audience that you might have with a letter. So which books are they, you ask? Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude. So these are the remaining epistles or letters of the New Testament that Paul did not write. And so we will kind of walk through these rather quickly, and then we'll have some more focused time on them. So all of them are pretty much written in a context of persecution or suffering. And maybe suffering is the better word, or threat. So this context of suffering or threat, and we probably need to think about this not so much in terms of the Roman Empire out to get Christians. I know sometimes when we think about the early church and facing persecution and suffering, the image we get is that the Roman Empire is kind of out to get Christians, kind of a search and destroy mission of getting rid of Christianity. But that just wasn't the case. And there were times when you had very intense persecution by Rome, such as in the 90s under Domitian, and in the Rome area under Nero, sometime around 64 to 68. But Nero wasn't always out after Christians looking to persecute them, to kill them. That only happened when the fire was started and he needed someone to blame. And even then, it wasn't really an empire-wide attack on Christians. It was much more localized around Rome. So I know that we kind of have this notion that the Roman government was really out to destroy Christianity, out to put Christians to death, and inflicted a lot of suffering on Christians. But across the first century, that wasn't the normal case. Instead, what we normally had was your threat, your suffering would initially come from your family. And so you become a believer in Jesus, and now you're facing pushback, and maybe even you're being ostracized from your family, and your family no longer claims you, they disown you. Possibly if you come from a Jewish family and you become a believer in Jesus, your family disowns you for joining that movement it's just foolish to worship a crucified Messiah with all these Gentiles. And so maybe you're facing persecution that way. Or if you're Gentile, well, your family had its family gods, and you would be a threat now to the well-being of family because you were offending the patron deities, those gods and goddesses that would watch over your family and kind of protect your family. Well, now you've enraged them because you reject them, you don't worship them, you don't honor them, you worship only Jesus. And so your family kind of has to disown you or risk the gods being offended at the whole family. So most likely your initial kind of persecution or threat is going to come from your family. They're going to make you suffer in some kind of way because you've turned to Jesus and you've rejected the family gods. Your neighbors, same type of deal. And so the community that you're a part of, your neighbors, maybe it's your extended family as part of that, they're going to reject you and ostracize you and put you down. Because same thing, you've offended their gods, you've offended the heritage. So whether you're Jewish, whether you're Gentile, you have offended. And it's like you are kind of spitting in the face of Judaism. And so your neighbors, they're going to shun you, put you down, speak ill of you because you've rejected Judaism, their God. Same thing in terms of Greco-Roman religions. You're going to bring disaster upon the whole community. And so they want to disown you to try to separate themselves from you. And in terms of what the gods will do to you, they don't want to be part of that. They want to distance themselves from you. And so they might shut you down. You'll be ostracized. Work, same type of deal. So you may have belonged to a guild if you were part of a craft, a trade, and now the gods of that guild, again, Greco-Roman world, lots of gods, kind of patron deities over everything. And so if you become a Christian and you worship only Jesus, then you might be out of work. You might have your guild kind of isolate you and not send you any business or do business with you. And so, very risky, if you will, to become a Christian, because you're going to catch it from your family, from your community, from your work, your co-workers, the guild that you're a part of, and then finally civic. So all the villages had gods and goddesses that were worshipped, that were kind of watched over that village. And so you become a Christian, now you are kind of putting your village at risk, because you're not offering sacrifices and paying homage to the gods that watch over your city, your village. And so the city is going to, distance you from themselves and, ostracize you, put you down, make life difficult for you. And so that would be the kind of pressure that you would face for becoming a Christian, that is not directly coming from Rome. The emperor isn't out to get you, but rather it's the people around you that see your conversion as a threat to the status quo, see your conversion as a threat to their well-being, see your conversion as an action that's going to anger the gods. And so the gods will take that vengeance out upon you, and they don't want any collateral damage. They don't want it to come upon them. So they will push you out there, and they'll stand back from you and cut you off. So that was where most of the threat came from and the suffering that came from. So kind of an economic suffering and a social suffering, that type of thing. Rarely would Rome get involved. When they did get involved, it was because somebody turned you in as being treasonous for worshiping another king, for asserting that Jesus is king instead of the emperor. But for the most part, nobody's going to go to that extreme. And for the most part, Rome's not going to deal with you because they already crucified Jesus. So it's like it's over and done. Okay, so that's kind of the setting. Now, with Hebrews, we think it's probably written somewhere before 70. And the big message is, don't revert back to Judaism. So it looks like it is written for people that know the Old Testament very well. So probably written for Jewish believers. And there would have been pressure to revert back to Judaism. And maybe most of that pressure is kind of coming from their own people. And what the writer of Hebrews, we don't know who the writer is, but the writer of Hebrews is emphasizing that Jesus is superior. And so don't revert back to Judaism, that Christianity, Jesus is superior to Judaism. And so stay faithful, worship Jesus, no matter how costly it might be, it will actually be worth it. And so don't revert back, because if you revert back, you're gonna miss out on the blessing. Okay, so Hebrews, don't revert back to Judaism. Lots of pressure coming to revert back, and so don't do that. Okay, James. James is most like the Sermon on the Mount. And so the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is teaching all about the righteousness of the kingdom. James is emphasizing, and it's written very much the same way as the Sermon on the Mount, emphasizing right living. And so in a sense, what James is saying, even though you're going through this suffering, even though you're dealing with this threat, and there's a lot of pressure on you to kind of conform to the world and the way the world operates, James is saying, no, you need to stay faithful. And so close the hypocrisy gap. You say you follow Jesus, well, put it into practice. You say that you are a people set apart for the Lord. Okay, live like it. Close that hypocrisy gap. And so he's going to emphasize wisdom. He's going to emphasize that we need to have a genuine faith and what that genuine faith looks like. And he's going to say, count it all joy that you're going through this suffering, because it is actually growing your faith, testing your faith, and it becomes a time of growth and demonstration and persevering. And so you'll end up with a mature faith. So James, in the midst of it, closed the hypocrisy gap. A good chance that James is the first letter that we actually have, that it was written before the Jerusalem Council, maybe even before Galatians. And so somewhere in the mid-40s, James is writing. Who is this James? Well, the general consensus is, or the tradition is, that it's James, the brother of Jesus, who becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church. That it's not James the disciple, it's James, the brother of Jesus. He becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church. And so he writes his letter to believers who are scattered. And the goal is to help them really put into practice the teachings of Jesus, so close the hypocrisy gap. 1st and 2nd Peter. So written by Peter, and we think sometime around 62. And at this point, I think I might have mistakenly mentioned back in Mark that Peter was in Rome incarcerated. He wasn't incarcerated at the time of writing 1st Peter. So he is in Rome, he's writing from Rome and to churches in the eastern part of the empire, to believers in the eastern part of the empire. And he is challenging them and trying to encourage them to stay faithful to Jesus, to keep living the Christian life, even though they're facing suffering, even though they're facing threat. And one of his most powerful images is that in your suffering, trace Jesus. You know how you learn to write your alphabet and you have the letters with kind of the broken lines, and you learn to trace over the letters, and you learn how to make an A, you learn how to make a B, etc. Kind of the dotted lines, you're tracing that. It's kind of the same imagery that Peter is using, that Jesus suffered, and we are to imitate, we are to trace Jesus in our suffering. And so James is trying to encourage them, Peter is trying to encourage them that as they face their suffering, as they face persecution, that they would suffer well, and that their minds would be set upon Christ, and that they would trace Jesus as they go through their trials. Okay? And 2nd Peter, a little bit more like Jude, where there's a lot of warning against false teaching. And so that's kind of another place of threat where false teaching would lead you astray, make life a little bit more, quote unquote, comfortable in the world if you buy into the false teaching. And so Peter in 2nd Peter and Jude saying, don't buy into the false teaching. We're just trying to tell you what you want to hear. Don't fall for that. And then 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, written by John, tradition has it, is that emphasis is that God is light and that God is love. And so as you go through difficult circumstances, and one of the things that we see in 1st John is that there was actually a split in the church, that there was a group in the church that went out from the church. And John says, well, that's evident that they never really bought into us. And so John's emphasizing that God is light, that God is love. And we will take a closer look at 1st John, a little bit of 2nd and 3rd John next week when we work with the Johannine material. So what we're going to do is Hebrews, James, and 1st Peter. For Hebrews, I'm going to have you watch YouTube by the Bible Project. So I'll have that posted for you. For James, I'm going to have you listen to a sermon that I think catches what James is really all about, what James is driving for. And then I'll have a separate lecture on 1st Peter. And so those are the Catholic epistles. And again, kind of this context of suffering and threat. And each writer in their own way is trying to empower them to resist the threat, to live faithful through the suffering, and to know the hope that we have in Christ. So that's it for this one. And just want to encourage you to make sure you watch the YouTube on Hebrews from the Bible Project, that you listen to the sermon from James, and then I'll have one more lecture this week, one more video this week on 1st Peter. All right, thank you for tuning in. We are beginning to close out this semester. Have a great day.